It's my great pleasure to introduce Christos Papadimitriou, our distinguished lecturer today. He is the Donovan Family Professor of Computer Science at Columbia. He's been a professor at many universities and has written many textbooks and many great papers on a wide variety of topics, from algorithms and complexity to databases, game theory, and so on. And most recently, he's working a lot on subjects related to the brain. He's also won many, many awards. I won't list them, member of the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering, and many, many awards I won't go through. And he's also the author of 3 novels and has played in rock bands. So basically he does it all. Anyway, he's going to tell us today about how the brain begets the mind.
Thanks, Anna. Hello, everybody. Delighted to be back to one of my favorite computer science departments. I just want to point out for all of you, that what is happening right now is nothing short of miraculous. Perhaps many of you study the brain, but even for you, I'm sure that what's happening right now is a deep mystery. Because what happens, you see, is that I create airwaves in my space, and through technology, these airwaves are reproduced in your space. And then the miracle happens. What happens is that through your ear and cochlea and auditory cortex, these things get in your brain and they become hierarchical tree structures, which, if I'm very lucky, you will never forget. So this is not normal, okay? This is incredible. And I'm going to elaborate why it's extremely difficult to visualize that, even if you know all about the brain. And one of the things that so this is something that has been I have been obsessed with, understanding how this happens. And one of the things that woke me up to it, so that there is some hope, is a bunch of experiments, and I'm going to show you just one of them. That happened at NYU a few years back. What they did is they made a recording heard by many subjects. It was sort of words, single syllable words in English and in 5 other languages, hundreds of subjects, and they recorded from all of them, from the brain of all of them. And so what the people heard is something like this, at 4 hertz, 4 times every second, approximately the same speed I'm speaking right now. And then they took the data from 100 recordings from maybe perhaps an hour from each. And what they did is they took the Fourier transform, and you get, spectral analysis. No surprise, there is a peak at 4 hertz. And because 4 times every second, the brain of these people had to fetch this word and see if they understand its meaning and so on. So the next thing they did was very clever. They repeated the same experiment, except that every 4 words made sense. Okay, like this. And guess what happened? There were 3 peaks now. There is still the 4 hertz peak, but there is a 1 hertz peak. Why? Because every second, the brain creates a new sentence. And there was also a peak at 2, because every second, you see, these are sentences like bad cats eat fish, little boy kicks ball. Twice every second, there is a phrase being created. Okay, so I'm convinced that what happens is this. If you think about it, that right now your brain creates trees, it's very hard to believe. Okay, so many years ago, I had after I read these results, I had lunch with Chris Manning, a famous NLP person from Stanford, and I don't know what came to me, but in the middle of the lunch, I left my fork down. I looked him in the eye and said something very strange, like, "For the love of God, Chris, do we have trees in our brain?" And Chris Manning thought for a while, and he said, "Yeah, I believe we have trees in our brain." And I chose Chris because I thought that he would be one of the most reserved people about having trees in our brain. And this made me think, how can you do this? How can you create 3 representations in about a dozen spikes per step? In other words, for every step of the algorithm that creates the trees, parallel steps, I mean, I'm talking about parallel time now, you need a dozen spikes. You can do it in dozen spikes. And why dozen? Because the neuron spikes are about 50 hertz and language is about 4 hertz. So if you divide, you get that in dozen spikes, you might create a new node, a new internal node, which is incredible. I mean, I don't think anybody understands how this can be done. Here is another experiment. They read to subjects things like sentences like the ball hit the track and the track hit the ball. And different areas in their brain responded to tracking the two sentences. So this means that our brain stores subjects and objects in different places, okay? So amazing things happen in our brain when we process language and when, of course, we generate language. But I mean, so when you have a very, very difficult problem, I guess one thing you can do is to generalize it, okay? And ask the question of my title, how does the mind emerge from the brain? Okay, so, and you know, there are two sciences, two glorious and fantastically accomplished sciences, cognitive science and experimental neuroscience, that study this problem. But they have a huge gap between them, not only of scale, so, you know, 10 to the 12 scale, but also other stuff. I mean, there is gap in mindset, in scientific methodology and scientific attitude, and of course subjects and so on. I mean, you know, the kind of animals they use for their work, experimental work, and all that. So there is a huge gap, and this was identified by Richard Axel, who's my hero in this Nobel Prize 2004, my hero in this business, who said, I mean, I could not, when I read this, that Axel has said this, I felt that I was blessed by the Pope, because this is the problem I've been working on. We do not have a logic for the transformation of neural activity into thought. I view discerning this logic as the most important future direction in neuroscience, okay? There are two huge surprises here. One is that Richard Axel, a hardened experimental neuroscientist, uses the word logic, okay, which to us, and to everybody, I believe, has echoes of certainly some kind of formality, formal system, and ultimately computational. And the question is the following: what kind of formal computational theory would qualify as Axel's logic? And the summary of my talk is that I have a proposal and I want to show it to you. So here's the question. You know, I teach a course, Computation in the Brain, the first, and I basically blow the first lecture of my course by discussing the question: is the brain a computer? Is your brain a computer? Okay, so, you know, sort of one of these very useful if meaningless questions. And the final answer, you know, my answer is the following: yes, I believe the brain is a computer, because if the brain is not a computer, then I have no hope of ever understanding the brain. Okay, you know, so in other words, I'm not ideological about it, I'm methodological about this question. So where does computation happen in the brain, assuming that it does? It certainly happens in molecules, okay? I have no doubt about that. It also certainly spikes in neurons and synapses and neural circuits. Of course, it happens in dendrites. Some people will tell you that's where computation, dendrites are the input devices of the neuron. That's where the real computation happens. And definitely happens in the whole brain, in the sense that cognitive scientists run experiments on humans, record from them, and then they write papers that say, you see, the subject's brain responds as if it's executing the following program. Okay, so, you know, and so it is very productive to think that the brain is a computer at that granularity, at the whole brain granularity. And the question is that we don't know what's in between, okay? And my proposal is this, that there is something that I call assemblies of neurons and their operations. I'll tell you immediately what they are. And you are looking for something, first of all, that can be implemented. You know that it's implemented by spiking neurons and synapses, and can implement cognitive phenomena. Okay, so, you know, this is what Axel means by logic. Okay, so this is what we're looking for. Okay, All right. So what are assemblies? In the 70s and 80s, neuroscientists were telling us that there is something called the grandmother cell, okay? And this means it is a cell. Every time it fires, we remember our grandmother. But later, we wised up, and we call them Jennifer Aniston cells, okay? First of all, we found them in people. And the point is that, so, you know, they recorded from a few neurons, they showed a couple of hundred pictures, and they hit a cell that consistently responded to images of Jennifer Aniston. And then the back of the envelope calculation shows they couldn't be so lucky. And there must be not one Jennifer Aniston cell, but maybe 30,000 Jennifer Aniston cells, okay? So, and this is how our brain remember memories, okay? By having, because you see, if our grandmother was one cell, every cell in the brain takes input from thousands of neurons. So if our grandmother is one cell, then there is no grandmother. So, incidentally, after this talk, not only you will have Jennifer Aniston cells, but you are going to have Jennifer Aniston cells, okay? Think about it, but don't go this way. Okay. So what are assemblies or ensembles of neurons? First of all, I mean, the founder of cognitive neuroscience, Donald Hebb, 70-something years ago, imagined them, okay, dreamed them. And the neuroscientists took about more than half a century to actually find them in animals, because they are hard to check, hard to find. But they succeeded. And now, I mean, my colleague Rafa Yuste here at Columbia, who calls them ensembles and does want to discuss it, not only sees them, but creates them, fires them, finds them in many parts of the brain, and so on. So assemblies are not something that I pulled out of a hat. Okay, it's you know, they are old news. So what's an assembly? It is a large and densely interconnected set of excitatory neurons in the brain area, whose firing in some pattern is tantamount to our thinking of a particular memory, concept, person, name, word, episode, etc. Okay, and Yori Busaki, in his popular book, calls them the alphabet of the brain. Okay, so for those of us who remember the conundrum, is intelligence symbolic or sub-symbolic, you can think of assemblies as the place where these two meet in the brain. Okay, good. And a year plus ago, with my friends, we published this paper, which the title says it all. We show how we believe that brain computation could be done through these assemblies, okay, through assemblies of neurons. And I'm going to explain to you how it works. So this is the assembly hypothesis, that there is an intermediate level of brain computation which fills the gap of the question mark in that slide. It is implicated in higher cognitive functions, such as reasoning, planning, language, math, science, music, storytelling, the good stuff. And assemblies of neurons are its basic representation, its main data type. Okay, and there are operations. Okay, so a calculus needs operation and projection, association, merge, pattern complete, plus some control commands. But I'm not going to bother you with all of this. I'll just focus on projection. I'll explain to you what a projection of between assemblies is. And it's the following very simple idea. Imagine you already have an assembly on the area on the left of the screen. And the red arrow says that there are a lot of synapses going from the left part of the screen to the right part of the screen, whereas the green arrow says that there are also recurrent synapses going from the right side of the screen to itself. And then this Kabbalistic symbol here, purple symbol, is inhibition. It means that there are other neurons who sort of, you know, the firemen of the brain. So, you know, they're trying to tell, don't get so excited to every neuron, okay? And there is also Hebbian plasticity, which means that if a neuron fires now and as a result, another neuron fires. Then there is a synapse between them. Then the weight of the synapse is increased by little. Okay, so all these things put together create assemblies. I mean, and these, by the way, are basic tenets of neuroscience. So let's see. Imagine now that this assembly fires, all of the neurons fire together. Because of the red arrow and because of the purple inhibition, what will happen is that a few of the neurons in the right-hand side will be selected, the ones who got the most synaptic input from the left are going to be selected and they will fire, okay? But now that both of these fire, the situation has changed dramatically in the sense that now the right-hand side of the screen, this area gets input also from the blue assembly, okay? Not only from the gray, but from the blue assembly as well. And as a result, a different set of winners are going to be selected. Winners, by winners, I mean the ones that are going to survive, the ones that got the highest synaptic input from this firing. And because of Hebbian plasticity, by the way, these synapses that fired are now a little stronger. And now the same thing is repeated, okay? And so on. And now one wonders, does this process converge? Does it converge after a dozen or so steps? And is the result densely connected? Because remember, assemblies have to be densely connected. And if you are a computer scientist, you realize that this is non-trivial, because how do you, in a random GNP mess, sort of, you know, in a random graph, very sparse random graph, how do you select a huge set of neurons that are densely connected, okay? That's a well-known difficult problem. And will it respond to a new firing of the stimulus, okay? In other words, will the stimulus, will the first assembly summon it every time it fires again? Because that's what you want. Will it pattern complete if you fire a small part of it? Is it so stable that it's going to regenerate its whole self? Is stimulus overall preserved? Here's this question. Imagine that we have two stimuli on the right-hand side, and you create two assemblies. And these stimuli overlap. Let's say they share 20% of the neurons. Will the resulting assemblies also share about 20% of the neurons, okay? And many, many other questions. And the answer to all of this is yes, okay? And how do I know? We have demonstrated by simulations in an idealized model, okay, which I'm going to explain to you. Also by simulations in biologically realistic models of spiking neurons. So, you know, we made smaller experiments, but with very much more elaborate neurons, which are supposed to mimic in convincing ways the way real neurons operate. Plus, many of these behaviors have been observed in experiments with real brains. And finally, we have proved that all this happens with high probability. Why high probability? Because it relies on randomness, and the random event is the creation of the connectome. Okay, so you know what is random here is the way with these million neurons are connected. And if you exploit this randomness, okay, those of you who are graph theorists know this, that there's nothing more certain than a random graph. Okay, so you know, because of the central limit theorem. So in the same way, you can predict what will happen in the high probability if the graph is sufficiently random. Okay, so this is, I'm going to explain to you, for the theoreticians in the crowd, the mathematical model, because I think, I mean, not many talks have a slide like that, a mathematical model of the brain. Okay, but so here goes. We have a finite number of brain regions. Each brain region contains n neurons, and inhibition means that only k of them fire. K winners take all. Some pairs of areas are connected by fibers. These are the red arrows. And these are connected by random connections, okay? Any two neurons in these areas have the equal probability P of being connected. And all of them are recurrently connected as random graphs, okay? So neurons fire in discrete steps. That's an assumption that is both irresistible, very convenient, but also hard to defend. The K neurons with the highest synaptic input are selected to fire next. And we call this random project and cap, followed by cap, okay, RPNC, and it's an important primitive. It models the inhibition excitation equilibrium. Connections between areas can be inhibited and disinhibited. In other words, the red arrows can be on and off. And plasticity means that if there is a synapse from I to J, I fires. In the next step, J fires, the weight of I is multiplied, let's say, by 1.1. And there are many other, but I know the main ideas of this model, in some sense, they are the main ideas in all of life: randomness, selections, and plasticity. Okay. And the point is, as you realize, all these rules define a dynamical system, whose a discrete time dynamical system, whose state is which neurons have fired in the last step and what is the weight of all the edges. This is the whole state of the system. And assemblies of neurons are an emergent behavior of this dynamical system. Okay, they are not like primitives. Okay, they are an emergent behavior. We can prove that they, and we can watch in simulations that they do emerge. By the way, you could contrast this with the chip. Okay, so you know that the chip is also a dynamical system, except that we are focusing on some sort of attractors, we restricted some attractors of the system to some special areas of the system that we call bits. Okay, so something like that happens here. But in order to do computation, we have to restrict the modes of the system to the case where assemblies is the predominant behavior, and this is what we're doing. So is this model realistic? Okay, so that's a fair question, especially from people who are not in neuroscience. And here is my take. Synchronous spiking, in other words, discrete time, and is unrealistic but not distortive, because we compare it with asynchronous models, and we observe very similar behavior. The operation random project and cap is a natural simplification of excitatory inhibitory balance, which we know happens in brain areas. So the reds are caveats, okay? So are warnings that neuroscientists will tell you that, will tell this, okay? That the connectome is not GMP, but that's okay in the following sense: that we know that the connectome deviates from GMP, but it deviates in ways that don't harm our arguments. And also, something else that neuroscience are going to tell you, that assemblies and plasticity had not been much thought to work at this time scale. In other words, nobody disputes that they exist, but not so fast. Okay, so
Christos, can you define connectome?
By connectome, I mean I use this fancy word to mean the random graph that underlies this model. Okay, so this model, especially this page of this slide of the model, defines a random graph, and this models the synaptic connections in the brain. Okay, and that's usually sometimes it's called the connectome.
And is there an input here?
Yes, of course, all in good time. Yeah, so the input, if you wish, will have to come from the outside. So remember when I called one of these assemblies the stimulus, so the first, here's another thing. How was the first assembly created? Okay, and they're created from sensory organs. Okay, by eventually creating a representation of a whole object, and this is projected to the hippocampus, which is our continuous renewed memory, and from then it's copied, if it's lucky, to other areas to start a very interesting life. Projection is how assemblies are born, and propagated. Okay, I guess I said all this. From the hippocampus to the association cortex. Association cortex is everything except for our sensors, to enact brain computation and cognitive phenomena. And so these are the assembly operations, and you can ask how powerful is the system, and there's a theorem that it can perform with high probability, arbitrary, n over k space computation. Square root of n over k is a few dozen, perhaps 100. Okay, and this means that it's like having circuit depth 100. You can do a lot of things.
What is n and k here?
Sorry, n is the number of neurons in the area, typical in an area, typically in tens of millions, and k is the number of cells in an assembly, which is, let's say, a few thousands. Recall this, that what we want. I have argued that assembly of neurons and their operations can be implemented by spiking neurons and synapses, but can they do anything? Can they implement cognitive phenomena? Okay. In other words, our job now is to find higher cognitive functions that can be carried out in this framework. Okay. Okay. And this brings me back to language. We have known a few things about the language organ for a long time. We knew about Broca's area where syntax happened. We know that there is Wernicke's area where words are selected and the roles in the sentence is selected. We have known for 150 years about these two areas. But slowly we accumulate some knowledge with experiments like the ones I showed you. And in fact, there is a recent book by Angela Friederici, which essentially summarizes, of course, from her point of view. She's a famous German linguist, cognitive scientist, and cognitive neuroscientist. What we know, okay? What we know is this, that how do we understand language? First of all, it starts at the lexicon. There is an area which we pretty much know where it is, and where you have probably 100,000 assemblies that represent words, okay, the words you know. And then there is Wernicke's area, where basically the words are assigned some role, okay? There are assemblies for word there that Mysterio seem to communicate to the lexicon and assign some roles. And finally, there's Broca's area, where the nodes of the tree, the internal nodes of the tree seem to reside. Okay, and if you read Friederici's book, which essentially I can recite by heart, you see there is a famous paragraph in page 134, where basically Friederici says, okay, that's what we know, but unfortunately that's a static picture, so we must be missing a lot of things. These things seem to communicate between them, but how can this be? Okay, and it says, well, I hypothesize that we have something called language mirror cells. Okay, this is the equivalent of, and then a miracle happens. Okay, and when I read this paragraph, I said, wait a minute, this is an author who is praying for assemblies. Okay, and I sent her our paper. And she wrote back and she completely agreed. Okay, so I wrote a paper this year, published this year, where we we argue that the assembly calculus is what you need to understand how language can happen in the brain. And now, next, I'm going to show you an experiment, okay, which sort of is the coolest thing I want to show you. We wrote a parser of English in the assembly calculus. So we used this theory to write a parser of English, okay? Okay, so here's how the architecture. We have, it's sort of, I'm copying from Friederici. There is an area which you call lex, where the subject, where you keep your assemblies associated with words. There is a Wernicke's area on the left, which is subdivided into sub-areas, which suspiciously are labeled verb, subject, object, preposition, adjective, determiner, and so on. Okay, so And importantly, there are fibers, there are these red arrows that connect, that can be inhibited and disinhibited, that connect these areas, okay? So, and we know that in this particular part of the brain, the left medial temporal lobe and the superior temporal gyrus, we know that there are evolutionarily novel neural fibers, okay? So here is, we assume, okay, many of you are asked, how will babies learn this? We don't know. This is the holy grail of a question, but we are not dealing with this. We assume to have an adult who has learned English, okay? So, and we are trying to guess how their brain is going to do this. And each word assembly has an action set, okay? It's not just passive neurons. There is an action set, implemented by interneurons that change the state of the brain. Inhibit, disinhibit commands. And this action set, it encodes its part of speech, its syntactic role. And when the word assembly fires, its action set is executed. And the sum total of word action sets, and there are linguists in the audience that are going to cringe, but I don't know what else to call it except the grammar, okay? So let's see what happens if we have a sentence like cats chase dogs, okay? And before the beginning of every sentence, the parser is in this state, okay? Which means that everything is inhibited except for the lex to subject fiber, which is disinhibited, which is ready to go, okay? Why is this? This is because this is English, okay? In Russian, it's completely different. But in English, we know that we are going to see the subject before we see the verb, so we can safely disinhibit the lex to subject fiber. And of course, lo and behold, here is the subject, cats. Because this is disinhibited, it will do what I showed you 20 slides before, and and it's going to project in the subject area. But now let's go back and look. How does this assembly for cats in the legs looks like? It consists of many neurons, but some of them, for example, are semantic neurons, okay? All animals share some of these neurons. Plural neurons, okay? All plural nouns have these neurons. Phonetic neurons, these are specific to cats, okay? How do you pronounce it? How do you recognize it? And also action neurons. And the action neurons are shared by all nouns, okay? All nouns have these red cells, okay? So there is a lot of sharing going on between the assemblies for words. So, and then that's the part of the action set of the word cats. It inhibits again the subject to the lex to subject fiber because it's not needed anymore. We are ready for, but then leaving, it is going to disinhibit these two fibers, lex to verb and subject to verb. And now dogs is ready to arrive, and chase is ready to arrive, and because this fiber is open, it projects and it makes a copy over there in the verb area, and because chase knows that it is a transitive verb, also opens the fiber from verb to object. Okay, and so when dogs comes, it is projected to the right object, and now okay. So it's fair to ask at this point, okay, this happens. How do I know that the sentence is parsed correctly? And here is why. Because assembly synaptic connections form a valid dependency graph, okay? In other words, you can read the parts by, and in fact, we have an assembly calculus program called readout, which goes through the whole thing and tells you, I see these arrows, and if these arrows are not the valid dependency graph of the sentence, it will scream. Okay, so this is what it means to parse. And this sentence was correctly parsed, and now it's ready for the next sentence, with the fiber from lex to subject ready. Okay. So it's written in a like slight assembly calculus. And this means, okay, that this is done exclusively, this program has no if then else, has no loops, has no variables. It is basically a dozen million neurons and a trillion of synapses, okay? And they spike, nothing else, okay? And they do this. After processing a sentence, it leaves behind a retrievable trail of side effects, the parse. The code is available, and we publish the paper in TACO. So here is an important consideration, okay? So, the AC is a programming language, okay? But it doesn't mean programming language usually is a license to sit down and write any program you want in this language. Not here, because there are important questions, okay, of biological plausibility. How are these programs designed? How are they learned? How are they executed? I mean, don't tell me that the brain has a loader and an instruction fetcher, okay? So it must be, this must be streamlined, okay? And these aspects must be plausible. And the parser is streamlined. Each input word causes the firing of the corresponding assembly, and the firing of this assembly affects changes on the state of the device, and the parser works. Then a blanket project command is executed, and so the assembly calculus, at least as it is used in the parser, is akin to a data flow language and execution environment. Okay, so this makes it, to my mind, I have no doubts that it is something that is biologically realistic. It parses simple sentences such as this: the young couple in the next house saw the old little white car of the main subject quite clearly. Okay, this would be parsed. The speed, if you translate it into spikes of the human brain and then to seconds, is as fast as I'm speaking right now. And with more work, we just finished the sentence embedding. But you can do other things like polysemy, ambiguity, backtracking, grammaticality. So we have gender agreement, number agreement. You can do many other things. So let me tell you something very cool that happened recently. So happened last week. We are working on doing center embedding. Center embedding is cats is parsing things, sentences like cats when they're fearless chase dogs. Okay, and of course, center embedding is in some sense the essence of recursion, the essence of what Chomsky was talking about, the essence of why he introduced context-free languages. So the question is, how do you do this? Okay, and of course, it would be great if you can store. The problem is cats. Fine, you see the comma. Oops, new sentence. Okay, I can do this. When they are fearless, parsed, new comma. Now it's the eternal question, of recursive calls. Where was I? Okay, in other words, what was the state? What was the state of the device here after the first comma? Okay, at the first comma, so I mean, it would be great to say, okay, we store the state of the brain, and we add how do you call them, a record? So an activation record in the stack. Okay, I don't know how to do this in the brain. So here is what we did. We say when you see the second comma, you have already kept the whole sentence from cats and on. And even if there were many words before, in some kind of working memory. And then you go back and you do something very simple. You don't project, but you just execute the action set of cats of all these words. And this brings you exactly to the state where the comma was. And then you ignore the next sentence, you see the next comma, and you continue executing, you continue parsing. And this is how we implemented recursion. Okay, so we made experiments. Also, you can do recursion, and so on. Okay, so the idea is parse on and return. Okay, this is how we handle it. Okay, Before this, the parser was a finite state machine, okay? Why? Because the state of the parser was the trio of fibers, okay? The ones that were disinhibited. But now it's something else, okay? Because it can do this return, okay? And we call it a fallback machine. At any point, it can return to the most recent marked symbol, unmark it, and continue, okay? Because this is exactly what this thing is. And the question is, fallback automata. What is the language accepted by fallback automata? Are you ready for this? Fallback automata is exactly the context-free languages, okay? And this, I think, sort of, is an amazing story in the following sense, okay? That 67 years ago, Chomsky decided to understand how universal grammar works. And as a result, came up with context-free languages. He did it for this explicitly, okay, and started studying them. And then he got the criticism that context-free languages are an overkill because they have features you don't need, but also it's missing features that language needs, okay, so human language needs. And as a result, sort of, Chomsky and his school listened to this criticism, and context-free languages was eclipsed from linguistics in the sense that sort of, grammar was very important. Context, but I believe that the only context-free rule that was in use was the basic one, that a sentence is a noun phrase and a verb phrase, okay? And now, 7 decades later, computer scientists trying to hack center embedding came up with an extension of their parser which goes all the way to the context-free languages, okay? So, I don't think that stories necessarily have a meaning, so, but stories are good, but it must mean something, okay? So that was the parenthesis. Speaking of Chomsky, okay, this question is sort of blasphemous, unaskable, okay? But frankly, if you do such an experiment, I think you are entitled to ask it, okay? Could it be? For example, we also have a Russian parser, and it's completely different. It has completely different structure in terms of labeling of subject, object, and so on, than the English parser, okay? And it has completely different action sets, completely different grammar. And the question is, the point is that English kids and Russian kids, they are born with the same brain, okay? And so, is this what they have in their language organ when they're born? And if so, how do they populate it? How do they design on these labels, on their words, on the action sets of the words, which implement the grammar? Okay, so these are questions that this experiment has begotten. Okay. Many questions. Okay, so how do assemblies learn and predict? It turns out that you can build a fine learning engine with assemblies. Planning with assemblies in the blocks world. So, the blocks world, as you know, is Terry Winograd's famous paper, famous system. Basically, you see this, you imagine this, and you want to output robotic commands like this, okay? And we can do it with assemblies. Okay, and also reasoning is something we are working right now. Cognitive scientists are profoundly divided about how reasoning is done in the brain. So we are trying to figure out what to do.
Quick question, Christos.
Yeah.
Josh Smith asks, why do you use the term disinhibited instead of activated?
Okay. I'm trying to show off my neuroscience. Okay, this is how it's all activated is what you want. Activated and disactivated. Yeah, same thing. Yeah. This is how we say it in my group, and this is how I should have said activated. You're absolutely right. Thanks. I have looked at many fields, but nothing is as fascinating and as impossible as this. Okay, this is by far sort of the hardest thing I've ever done. Sort of trying to understand neuroscience. Assembly, understand in the sense of make it computational enough so that I can play with it. Assemblies and operations seem to me a promising path to computation in the brain, to bridging the gap. And I mean, I just realized what a computational experiment can do for you. It brings you close, it entitles you to ask questions that before you couldn't. And here is another question. Do assemblies is what will fill the bill for Axel's logic? Okay. These are my collaborators. Santos Vepala, Georgia Tech, my colleagues, Google, Mitropolsky, my student at Columbia. That's it.
Thank you so much. Questions?
Thank you. That was an amazing talk. You mentioned that assemblies will need to do some of the other things that are important for brains, like predict and also post-dict and all that. And one question that's been on my mind a lot lately is how do we use prediction and post-diction to synthesize sort of narratives of hypotheses, and how to do that hierarchically and recursively, so that at the level of like the visual cortex or something, we're thinking this thing, there's a cat moving or something, right? But then we can synthesize it into language in the tree, like a recursive way across time. Sorry.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, fantastic question. Very much to the point. As then prediction is essentially. Some people think that that's the only thing that the brain does. Okay, so predict, and certainly the visual cortex seems to be extremely well poised to do prediction. Okay, so. It's I don't have we can do prediction, we can do learning, but I'm sure that the brain does it better. Okay, so we have algorithms with assemblies in the assembly calculus that can do these things, but it's just to answer questions, not to fill gaps in our understanding of assemblies, not to claim that that's how the brain does it. I mean, I'm sure that the prediction apparatus that we have in our visual cortex is much more specialized and agile. I mean, the lower, already the early stages of the visual cortex send neural commands to the muscles that move our eyes. So I mean, so it's an amazingly clever system. Okay, so and it's very hard to understand exactly how it works. I mean, that also I should tell you this. The assembly calculus is not meant to work in the visual cortex, auditory cortex, and so on. I mean, it's meant to work in the other part of the brain. Okay, so what is called association cortex, which essentially means all the cortex except for the sensory and motor. Okay, and for most time for rats. The association cortex is less than half of their brain, but for us is 95%. Okay, so and it's the hardest part to study because you cannot show stimuli and record and write a paper. Okay, so people don't.
This is just a follow up to what Aras asked, which is I mean, you had mentioned that this is you're trying to model the association cortex, and I think the great example you gave was the language processing with the projection and so on. So it wasn't clear to me if was that learned? I mean, was that actual parsing? Was it learned, trained in some way from examples, or was it coded up to just as a proof of concept to show that it could work? I mean, it wasn't really clear. Could you just clarify that?
Yeah. Okay. So absolutely not. Okay, it was coded up. If you ask me, what is the sort of the 500-pound open problem? is how babies populated. Okay, it's what I showed you earlier. So how there is I think it's a fantastic problem, and we're working on it. Okay, so how to, and of course it has to happen in the poverty of stimulus, or with very few examples. Okay, so so you hear a few sentences and you understand how sentences work and how to make them in your brain, how to sort of it's we'll figure it out. Okay, so we'll come up with a hypothesis. Frankly, okay, so what working on this is a little arrogant. Okay, so in some sense it's like for us, in the sense that you are saying the hypothesis is, suppose that the language organ is exactly like this. Okay, then we'll have an answer. Okay, but what's the chance? What are the chances that the language organ is exactly like a bunch of people who are trying to hack a parser? So much of the choices were because of programming expediency. Okay, so but the point is that there is no competing hypothesis, so we'll do it. Okay, we'll find out. But thanks. That's you asked the question we are working on. We finally got the courage to work on. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's alternate between the chat and the hand. So in the chat, there's the question by quote, assemblies are emergent. Does that mean that the random graph organizes into neurons that coordinate their spiking?
Yeah. Yes. So basically that's what emergent means. Yeah.
Preston, Chang.
Thank you for an amazing talk. I want to ask you questions about dimensionalities of neural activations, because recent work has been showing that in a lot of very high-level cognitive functions, and even to maybe things like motor planning, if you record from a lot of neurons and you do some kind of dimensionality reduction, you see the space of these neural activations are actually quite low dimensional. And I'm wondering, do you think that's related to the concept of these assemblies, where within an assembly, maybe the neural activations could be more or less synchronized or coordinated in some way? And does that maybe imply one of the ways the brain can learn these assemblies could be doing some kind of dimensionality reduction, which has relations to things like Hebbian learning and stuff like that? So I want to hear your thoughts.
So I'm familiar with the experiments you are talking about. So probably Mark Churchland is what you have in mind, right? Yeah. So yes. I know this paper as well. So as I told you, I don't think that the assemblies have much to do with the motor and sensory cortex. Okay, I think they are. Of course, all animals have hippocampus, and as a result, they have a proto-assemblies. But to answer your question, okay, so the beautiful observation that you can in 3 dimensions, you can see really what the motion is. So and turns out to be circular in some sense more often than you expect. This is something that we learn in the motor cortex, but it's unlikely to repeat in elsewhere. Okay, so so these things need to be multidimensional. Okay, so you cannot your 100,000 words that I don't think they can be plotted in 2 dimensions. You know what I'm saying? Or 1,000 or 10,000. Okay, so I think they are really high dimensional vectors.
Richard Ladner asks if assemblies can explain creativity, poetry, and fallibility.
Yeah. Hi, Richard. I'll tell you. Okay, I was, when I was interviewing for Columbia, I was interviewed by Richard Axel. Okay, so he told me, we were talking about association. Association is 2 assemblies that are for 2 people that are related, like a married couple. So they tend to overlap. Okay, they tend to share a lot of neurons. He told me sort of, I understand you are working on associations. I mean, so, in neuroscience, we look at the pathologies to find the truth. Okay, so let's think, what are the pathologies of association? And when I thought of synesthesia, he told me, okay, that's one, and then I told him, what's another one? And he told me creativity, ingenuity. Okay, so, in other words, what's creativity? Creativity is making an association you had no right to. Okay, here is explanation of creativity by assemblies. Now poetry. Okay, so that's there are books written about defining poetry. Okay, what is poetry and what is not. Okay, so many people think that poetry is a cognitive phenomenon. It has to do with the large large portion of white space in the page. Okay, so that this is what makes poetry. Okay, I'm not sure I believe this. Okay, but Pedro has a question.
Hey, Christos, how's it going?
Good. How are you, man?
Good. So, I have many questions which we can talk about later. But one that I think may be, of benefit to the broader audience is that, in the last 7 years, people have proposed a lot of computational theories of how associative memory works and how it supports cognition and whatnot. And but you haven't really touched on how your theory relates to them, what it does that they don't do, and vice versa. So I'm curious about that.
I have worked on association, in associative memory, and I'm currently running some experiments, in our simulator system that have to do about that. I'm trying to what is the tip of the tongue problem. Okay, so you see somebody very well in the street, and you say he's a computer scientist, he's German, he's tall. What's his name? Okay, that's. So we are, I believe that, I'm sure that a lot of association phenomena can be done in the brain. So it can be done by assemblies, but we are only starting. We know. There is a beautiful experiment which I had prepared to show you, but there was no time. Which is the following: they show to subjects a lot of pictures. Okay. Their brother, so on. So there is one neuron that is the Eiffel Tower neuron, okay? And then there is another neuron that is their brother neuron, okay? So so that's these are two neurons that belong to the assemblies for the two things. And then they Photoshop the picture of the brother in front of the Eiffel Tower, okay? And after that, the brother neuron fires when it sees the Eiffel Tower. Okay, so basically we have seen association happen, in experiment. You understand what I'm saying? What happened is that this.
Yes, but come on, Donald Hebb already saw association happen in his experiments, right? There's much more. Let's not think just in terms of, associative memory, but like cognitive architectures, right? Right.
Yeah.
The architectures that I think in like SOAR and ACT-R and more recently,
right. Yes, certainly.
Those seem to have a lot of the flavor of what you're describing here.
Yeah,
and account for a lot of these things,
yeah.
right?
So I understand SOAR and ACT-R very well. I think I'm doing something that interests me much more. Yeah. So I study them. Every reviewer asks us, but we have easy answers. Okay, how about ACT-R? Okay, so it's a very different. It's a beautiful system that has very different scope and goal.
What about these more recent theories about intermediate structures? Like people like Jeff Hawkins, for example, have proposed like these. Or not proposed, but like neuroscientists have proposed, and then people have made computational versions of them, like, cortical columns and predictive coding, of whom, of course, Raj is the world expert, and the circuits involving thalamus and like Rick Granger, for example, has a whole career of building models like this, which maybe are closer to what you're doing in flavor.
Right. So I believe that much of what we are talking about, it talks about sort of, a wonderful, well-studied, much better understood thing that is sort of, the sensory cortex. Okay, the thalamocortical circuit. So all these things pertain to predictive coding, pertain to something that I'm not trying to model.
Okay, I need to interrupt here. I'm sorry. I'm afraid we're out of time. I apologize to people who put questions in the chat, but
I'm happy. I mean, if I'm happy, I will answer your email.
Yeah, so please follow up with Christos. That would be great. And let's all thank Christos right now. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Great to be there.